We are taught that the Earth is a finished puzzle. 7 continents, fixed borders, solid ground. But that is a mistake. If you strip away the water, the familiar face of our planet changes into something unrecognizable. Right now, beneath the container ships of the South Pacific, hides a landmass of 5 million square kilometers. It isn't a collection of islands. It isn't a volcanic ridge. It is a fully formed continent that was pulled into the abyss. And it is not the only one. Deep beneath the soil of southern Europe lie the crushed remains of Greater Adria, a landmass that didn't just sink, it was literally skinned alive by tectonic plates. In the North Sea, fishermen drag up harpoons from a civilization that was erased by a wall of water moving at the maximum speed of a Formula One car. These are not myths like Atlantis. This is the reality of our planet. Today, we are going to drain the oceans. We will walk the streets of the Ghost Atlas to uncover the massive continents missing from modern maps and face the terrifying truth they prove. The Earth is not a home. It is a conveyor belt, and we are just next in line. Our first stop is the newest addition to human knowledge. While it formed eons ago, science officially recognized it only in 2017. Finally putting a name to the anomaly hiding directly beneath the most isolated country on Earth. If you were to completely drain the South Pacific today, New Zealand would cease to be 2 islands. The water would recede to reveal that these islands are merely the highest mountain peaks of a colossal landmass, almost double the size of India. This is Te Riu-a-māui, or Zealandia. For decades, geologists stared at bathymetric maps of the ocean floor surrounding New Zealand and saw something that shouldn't exist. According to the rules of geology, the deep ocean floor is supposed to be made of heavy, black basalt. But here, in the waters stretching from New Caledonia to the sub-Antarctic islands, samples kept bringing up granite, rhyolite and greywacke. These rocks are the absolute fingerprints of a continent. This discovery created an impossible paradox. Granite is light and buoyant. It's the stuff continents are made of, and it is supposed to float high above the waterline. So how did a landmass with the chemical makeup of a continent end up drowning under 2 kilometers of water? The answer lies in a catastrophic failure of structural integrity. 85 million years ago, Zealandia was attached to the supercontinent Gondwana. But when the tectonic forces tried to separate it from Australia, the plate didn't snap clean like a cracker. Instead, it behaved like hot taffy. The massive tectonic engines began to pull the landmass in 2 opposite directions. As the tension mounted, the continental crust, which was a solid 40 kilometers thick, began to mechanically stretch. And this is where the laws of physics delivered the death blow. Think of a piece of chewing gum. When it's in a ball, it sits high and thick. But if you pull it apart, the middle section becomes long, saggy, and incredibly thin. That is exactly what happened to the rock beneath New Zealand. The crust was stretched until it thinned down to just 7 kilometers. It lost its ability to fight gravity. According to the principle of isostasy, the height at which crust floats on the mantle depends entirely on its thickness. Because Zealandia had been stretched so thin, it simply didn't have the volume to displace the mantle and stay afloat. It became a geological victim of its own ductility. Slowly, relentlessly, the entire continent slumped 2 kilometers downward, inviting the Pacific Ocean to rush in and claim it. It wasn't destroyed, it simply lowered. Today, 94% of this giant is submerged, existing in a twilight zone. Too light to sink into the mantle, but too thin to rise above the waves. But while Zealandia merely sank, other continents faced a much more violent fate. As we are about to see in the Mediterranean, sometimes the Earth doesn't just drown a landmass, it recycles it. If you have ever hiked in the Italian Alps or vacationed on the coast of Croatia, you were likely walking on the corpse of a former continent. beneath the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean hides the scene of one of the most violent tectonic crimes in Earth's history. The victim was a continent the size of Greenland, known as Greater Adria. If you can say that Zealandia quietly slumped into the abyss of the ocean, then Adria was literally murdered. To understand this crime, we must look back 240 million years. At that time, Greater Adria was not just a random rock. It was a tropical extension of North Africa, a massive, thriving archipelago filled with coral reefs and shallow seas, similar to the modern Bahamas or Southeast Asia. But it was doomed by geography. When the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart, Adria was torn away from Africa and began a slow, doomed migration northward. It moved across the Tethys Ocean for millions of years, carrying its limestone shell directly toward a collision course. Waiting for it in the north was the massive, immovable wall of Europe. Usually, when two continents crash, they are of equal strength. They smash together and crumple upwards to form mountains, like two cars hitting head-on. But Adria hit Europe with such specific angling and density dynamics that something much more horrifying happened. The European plate acted like a giant geological plane, a sharp, immovable chisel. Because Adria's base was made of heavy, dense oceanic crust, it wanted to sink. But its top layer was made of light, sedimentary rock, limestone and coral. This created a fatal separation. As the main body of the continent was forced down into the mantle, subducting into the molten depths of the Earth, the upper layers of its crust were literally stripped away by the hard edge of Europe. Think of it like a carpenter's plane shaving a block of wood. The heavy steel blade of Europe stayed put, while Adria was pushed underneath it. The solid wood, the continent's base, went down into the trash, but the shavings, the limestone surface, curled up and piled on top of the blade. The result of this violent scraping of Adria's crust is the modern landscape of southern Europe. This is why geologists find marine fossils at the tops of peaks in Italy, Turkey and Greece. The Apennines, the Alps and the Dinaric Alps are not European mountains at all. They are the flayed skin of Greater Adria, crumpled and stacked up like wreckage at a crash site. The rest of the continent? It is gone. Using seismic tomography, essentially an ultrasound for the planet, geologists like Douwe van Hinsbergen have tracked the cold, dead slab of Adria sinking deep into the mantle beneath Greece. It is falling toward the core, like a heavy stone dropping through honey, while we ski and hike on its peeled-off skin. We travel now to the coast of Australia to solve the mystery of a continent that shouldn't be missing. If Greater Adria was a murder victim that left a body behind, our next case is a missing continent report that went unsolved for 7 whole years. We are moving to the Indian Ocean, specifically to a massive scar on the planet's crust known as the Argo Abyssal Plain, located just northwest of Australia. For decades, this region drove geologists to the brink of madness. The forensic evidence here is undeniable. The magnetic lines on the ocean floor prove that 155 million years ago, a massive chunk of land, about the length of the United States, broke off from Australia and drifted away to the northwest. We know exactly when it left. We know exactly how fast it moved. But for nearly a century, no one could find it. A continent doesn't just evaporate. Even if it sinks, like Zealandia, sonar should see it. Even if it subducts, like Adria, seismic tomography should detect it. But Argoland was nowhere. It had left a 5,000-kilometer-long hole in the map and simply vanished into the void. It wasn't until October 2023 that researchers from Utrecht University finally cracked the code. We hadn't been looking for the right kind of corpse. We were looking for a solid plate, but Argoland had suffered a much more chaotic fate. Argoland didn't sink, and it didn't just drift. It shattered. When it separated from Australia, the continent entered a zone of extreme tectonic divergence. The crust here was old and brittle, riddled with ancient fault lines. As the ocean floor behind it began to spread, it acted like a rack. pulling the landmass in multiple directions at once. The structural integrity of the continent simply failed. It couldn't stretch like Zealandia, so it snapped. Think of the difference between a sheet of metal and a sheet of glass. Under extreme pressure, Greater Adria acted like metal. It bent, scraped, and deformed. Argoland behaved like glass. It didn't bend. It literally shattered. It turned into a geological confetti of ribbons and blocks, which were then scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean. But why are we walking on it today? Why didn't these shards just drown? Because they were riding a conveyor belt. The ocean floor carried these fragments north until they slammed into the massive, immovable block of Southeast Asia. Because these shards were made of continental rock, they were too light to sink into the mantle. So, when they hit the subduction zone, they were scraped off the ocean floor and piled up one by one to form new islands. We couldn't find Argoland because we were looking for it in all the wrong places. Today, Argoland is hiding in plain sight. Its fragments form the bedrock of parts of Myanmar, the jungles of Borneo, and the islands of Java and Timor. It was transformed from a solid continent into an archipelago. But if Argoland was a puzzle solved by mapping the void, our next discovery required a microscope to uncover the disappearance. We traveled to the holiday paradise of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. To the average tourist, this is just a young volcanic island, a geological newborn that rose from the sea only 9 million years ago. But in 2017, geologist Louis Ashwal found something on these beaches that defied the laws of geology. On the beach, he wasn't merely studying fragments of volcanic rock, he was looking inside them, searching for tiny crystals known as zircons. Zircons are our planet's time capsules. They are incredibly durable minerals that crystallize inside magma as it cools. Once formed, they become almost indestructible, surviving erosion, pressure, and even the recycling of the crust. Most importantly, they contain uranium, which acts as a precise atomic clock, allowing us to calculate the exact date when the zircon was first forged. Ashwal took a piece of lava from this 9-million-year-old island and extracted the zircons inside. When he dated them, the machine didn't read 9 million years. It read 3 billion years. This was an impossible anachronism. It is the geological equivalent of finding a T-Rex bone inside a freshly poured concrete sidewalk. How can a crystal older than the majority of life on Earth exist inside a volcano that erupted literally yesterday by the standards of Earth's history? The answer revealed a tragedy of continental scale. Deep beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean lies a lost microcontinent known as Mauritia. Long ago, it was the land bridge that connected India and Madagascar, forming a solid, continuous landmass. But Mauritia had the misfortune of sitting directly on top of a mantle plume. A mantle plume is essentially a blowtorch from the Earth's core, a concentrated column of superheated magma that burns vertically through the crust. When India and Madagascar began to drift apart, this blowtorch turned on. It heated the rock of Mauritia from below until it became soft and ductile. The continent stretched, thinned, and finally snapped. The ocean rushed in, and the broken fragments of Mauritia sank to the bottom. But the blowtorch didn't stop. Millions of years later, it erupted again to build the modern island of Mauritius. As the magma shot up through the ocean floor, it punched through the submerged corpse of the lost continent. As the lava rose, it grabbed tiny fragments of the ancient crust and carried them to the surface. So, when you hold a handful of sand on a beach in Mauritius, you are holding the cremated remains of a lost world that once bridged the gap between India and Africa. But while rocks can wait billions of years to be found, biology does not have that luxury. We leave the deep time of the Indian Ocean and travel east, to a place where the tragedy is far more personal for humanity. Look at a map of Southeast Asia today. It is a fragmented jigsaw puzzle of islands, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, separated by shallow, warm seas. But if you could rewind the clock just 20,000 years, a blink of an eye in planetary history, this water would vanish, and you would see a massive, solid continent the size of the entire European Union. You possibly could hike from Singapore to Jakarta through a continuous, lush rainforest without ever seeing the ocean. This was the lost Eden of the Ice Age. This was Sundaland. While Europe and North America were locked under crushing sheets of ice, Sundaland was a tropical paradise for the humans who lived there. It wasn't just a dense jungle, it was a vast, open savanna known as the Great Sunda Plains. Because so much of the world's water was locked up in polar ice, the sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. This exposed millions of square kilometers of fertile lowlands that served as a sanctuary for life. Today, modern sonar reveals the evidence of this lost world etched into the ocean floor. Beneath the waves of the Java Sea, we can clearly see the winding channels of ancient riverbeds that have been submerged for millennia. These are the scars of the North Sunda River, a colossal waterway that flowed for over 2,000 kilometers. It was the Amazon of the ancient world. It connected the river systems of the Mekong and the Chao Phraya into one super river that fed a rich ecosystem supporting elephants, rhinos, tigers, and thriving human settlements. This wasn't just land, it was the nursery of civilization in the East. But 14,000 years ago, the planet's climate mechanism completely shifted gears, and the Great Thaw had begun. In the Northern Hemisphere, the ice sheets of North America and Europe began to collapse into the ocean. This triggered a catastrophic event known as Meltwater Pulse 1A. Usually, sea level rise is a game of millimeters, but during Pulse 1A, the ocean went into overdrive. The water rose roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. To a geologist, that sounds fast. But to the humans living in Sundaland, it was a generational nightmare. Imagine living in a coastal village. Every year, the high tide gets higher. Every storm surges further inland, poisoning your fresh water wells with salt. The beach where your grandfather fished is now a kilometer out to sea. From the perspective of the humans, it looked like a relentless siege. For thousands of years, the ocean chewed away at the edges of the continent. The massive plains of Sundaland were swallowed, turning lowlands into the Java Sea and mountain peaks into isolated islands. This created a human pressure cooker. As the water rose, millions of people and animals were forced to retreat from the drowning plains to higher ground. Populations that used to roam across millions of square kilometers were suddenly compressed into the narrow highlands of Sumatra, Borneo, and Java. This forced migration changed history. It sparked conflict, innovation, and the desperate search for new ways to survive. But for some, the squeezing of the land had a different effect. It didn't just push them uphill, it pushed them out. This leads us to a controversial but fascinating idea, that the drowning of Sundaland was the engine that kick-started human progress. Catastrophe is often the mother of invention. As the waters of the South China Sea and the Java Sea began to connect, turning the heart of the continent into a saltwater choke point, the people of Sundaland were faced with a binary choice: adapt or die. This geological squeezing created what anthropologists call a cultural pump. It was a simple, brutal equation of density. As the ocean swallowed the plains, millions of people were forced higher and higher, crowding into the shrinking highlands. Competition for food became fierce. Conflict was inevitable. But when the land ran out, humanity did something unprecedented. They didn't just fight for the remaining piece of land. They decided to leave it entirely. This is the core of the out of Sundaland theory. It suggests that this drowning world was the catalyst that forced humanity to master the ocean and the new continents. Before the Great Thaw, walking was enough. But as the land bridge submerged, the people of Sundaland were forced to innovate. To survive, they had to invent ships capable of withstanding the conditions of the open sea. They had to learn to read the stars and the currents to navigate the blue void of the ocean without getting lost. The destruction of their homeland didn't just end a culture, it gave birth to the first true maritime civilization. They turned the obstacle, the ocean, into a highway. Genetic data confirms this massive outward migration. We see markers in human DNA radiating outward from Southeast Asia during this exact period. These refugees carried more than just their genes. They carried their trauma. It is no coincidence that flood myths are a universal constant in human culture. From the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia to the Gunyu flood of China and the ancient traditions of the Australian Aboriginals. For a long time, we treated these as symbolic morality tales. But geology tells us they are actual eyewitness accounts. For 5,000 years, the global sea level rose relentlessly. But as the centuries passed, the specific details of the tragedy began to fade. Imagine the telephone game played over 100 generations. A grandfather tells his grandson about the specific river valley that was lost. The grandson tells his children about a great flood. By the time the story reaches the 10th generation, the real story has decayed into a legend. The rising water becomes the wrath of a god, and the lost valley becomes a magical kingdom. The story of Atlantis is not a prophecy, it is a memory. But if the inhabitants of Sundaland had thousands of years to escape the rising water, our next destination gave no such warning. Now we head to Northern Europe, to the cold waters of the North Sea. Here we will discover a lost world that was destroyed not by a long siege, but by a sudden and brutal execution. This is the story of Doggerland. To understand the scale of what was lost in Europe, you have to look at the map of the North Sea differently. Today, it is a cold, grey expanse of water separating the UK from France, Denmark and the Netherlands. But 10,000 years ago, this water didn't exist. Instead, there was Doggerland. This wasn't just a narrow land bridge that people sprinted across to get to England for a cup of tea. It was the biological heart of Northern Europe. While the surrounding areas, like Scotland and Norway, were still rocky, frozen and hostile environments recovering from the Ice Age, Doggerland was a low-lying sanctuary. It was a vast, fertile plain protected from the harsh winds, teeming with herds of deer and aurochs. It was a Mesolithic Eden. For generations, scientists considered the existence of this place to be just a theory, a mythical Atlantis of the North without proof. But the proof was waiting in the nets of Dutch trawlers. The breakthrough happened on the Doggerbank, a shallow sandbank in the middle of the sea that is actually the submerged high ground of the old landscape. Fishermen working these shoals would drag their nets across the seafloor expecting fish, but every so often, the nets would snag on something heavy. In 1931, the trawler Colinda hauled up a lump of peat from the bottom. Inside, they found a carved antler harpoon, perfectly preserved. It was the first smoking gun. Since then, the sea has surrendered more pieces of the puzzle. Massive mammoth tusks, lion's teeth. And in 2001, the blackened skull of a young Neanderthal man, known to science as Crine. He had a small tumor above his eye, a detail that brings him to life not as a fossil, but as a person who lived, hunted and suffered on this land. His presence is the definitive proof that this seabed was once a populated home for thousands of humans. But unlike Sundaland, which drowned slowly, Doggerland was living on borrowed time. 8,200 years ago, the North Sea was already rising due to the Great Thaw. The people had retreated to the last remaining lowlands, living on islands of marshy ground. They were adapting, but they didn't know that 300 kilometers to the north, a geological gun was being loaded. Off the coast of Norway, on the edge of the continental shelf, thousands of years of loose, unstable silt and glacial mud had piled up, held together only by the pressure of the ocean and frozen methane hydrates. And then, something, perhaps a minor earthquake or simply a critical mass of the glacier melting above, pulled the trigger. This triggered the Storegga Slide. In a matter of hours, 3,000 cubic kilometers of the continental shelf collapsed and crashed down the continental slope into the deep abyss of the Norwegian Sea. It's like a massive cube of earth the size of Mount Everest breaking off and falling into a bathtub. The displacement of water was catastrophic. It spawned a tsunami of biblical proportions. A wall of freezing dark water raced across the North Sea at the speed of a jet liner in deep water, slowing to the speed of a Formula One car as it hit the shallows. But it didn't lose its energy. For the people of Doggerland, there was no warning, no receding tide, only a loud, strange hum on the horizon that grew louder every second. The wave that hit the shore was likely over 20 meters high. It was a moving mountain of water, mud, and debris. It didn't just wash over the land, it erased it. The tsunami smashed through the fragile marshlands, overtopping the hills and salting the forests. It swept away entire tribes in seconds, burying their camps under meters of silt. When the water finally receded, the land didn't recover. The tsunami had destroyed the delicate ecological balance, and the rising sea level quickly finished the job. Britain was severed from Europe. The heart of the continent stopped beating. Doggerland sank forever, leaving behind only the bones in the fishermen's nets to prove it ever existed. But while Doggerland was destroyed by water, our next destination was preserved by ice. We travel now to the frozen north, to a land bridge that saved our species by giving us a path to a new world. This is the story of Beringia. When we are taught history in school, we are told that the first Americans crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. The very word bridge implies a narrow, functional road, a transit zone that needs to be crossed quickly to get to the other side, in our case, to North America. But that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the geography. For this land, known to science as Beringia, a mere bridge would be an insult. It was a full-fledged, vast landmass. At its peak, this territory was over 1,000 kilometers wide. It wasn't a temporary walkway. It was a massive, stable subcontinent that existed for thousands of years, creating a solid platform between the Asian and American continents. But how is that possible at the Arctic Circle? The answer lies in the physics of how the atmosphere works. While the rest of the Northern Hemisphere was buried under 3 kilometers of ice, technically, Beringia remained ice-free. The massive Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets covering North America were so tall, some over 4 kilometers high, that they physically blocked the moisture coming from the Pacific Ocean. That is why the air that reached Beringia was freezing but bone dry. Without moisture, snow couldn't accumulate to form glaciers. Beringia was no white, frozen wasteland. It was a unique, high-contrast ecosystem known as the Mammoth Steppe, a cold, dry grassland stretching from horizon to horizon, smelling of sagebrush and wind-blown dust. Beringia teemed with life. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and scimitar-toothed cats roamed these plains in vast numbers, feeding on the nutrient-rich grasses that grew in the endless summer days. And right beside them, in the shadow of the glaciers, were humans. But these people weren't just passing through. For decades, archaeologists believed that these hunters simply crossed Beringia quickly in order to get from Siberia to the America. But modern genetic analysis has revealed a phenomenon known as the Beringian standstill. The ancestors of Native Americans didn't just sprint across this bridge to reach the New World. They stopped, they settled, and they stayed. For nearly 10,000 years, roughly 500 generations, a distinct population of humans was trapped in this sanctuary. They were isolated from their Siberian ancestors by the freezing ocean to the west, and from the American continent by the impenetrable ice wall to the east. In this isolation, they built a distinct culture. They burned mammoth bone for fuel in a treeless landscape. They sewed warm clothes to survive the cold and dry wind. They became the apex predators of this steppe. It was here, on this lost continent, that the unique genetic markers of the indigenous peoples of the Americas evolved. They adapted to the cold, honed their hunting technologies, and waited for the world to change. And then, the global climate shifted. The ice finally began to melt. As temperatures rose, two large-scale geological events occurred simultaneously, sealing the fate of Beringia's inhabitants. To the east, the melting ice sheets finally cracked open, creating an ice-free corridor that led down into the heart of North America, inviting the humans to migrate forward. But behind them, the ocean began to wake up. As the glaciers turned to water, the global sea level surged. The dry plains of the Mammoth Steppe were flooded from the south and north. The humans were pushed forward, running from the rising tide into the new lands of the Americas. The door opened, and then the ocean slammed it shut. 11,000 years ago, Beringia vanished beneath the Bering Strait, cutting off the old world from the new. It was the greatest disappearing act in human history. But while Beringia was a massive land bridge, the lost lands we will discuss next are much harder to classify. They are not supercontinents, nor are they merely islands. They are microcontinents, isolated blocks of the Earth's crust drifting alone in the ocean. We begin our search in the most isolated stretch of water on Earth, the remote southern sector of the Indian Ocean near Antarctica. Here lies the Kerguelen Plateau. To a sailor on the surface, Kerguelen looks like a bleak, wind-swept archipelago. But these islands are just the tiny tip of a submerged monster. Beneath the waves lies a massive igneous province, 3 times the size of Japan. For a long time, geologists assumed this was just a pile of underwater lava. Why? Because usually, when you drill into the deep ocean floor, you expect to find only sterile basalt, the standard dark rock that forms when magma touches seawater. But in the late 1980s, the scientific drilling ship Joyde's Resolution punched a drill bit deep into the plateau's crust. And when they pulled the core samples back up, they didn't find just sterile basalt. Embedded in the rock were fragments of wood, charcoal, and pollen. This was a shock. Deep-sea volcanoes produce rock, not biology. And finding charcoal is even more telling, because charcoal is simply burnt wood. As you might know, you cannot have a forest fire underwater. This means that 90 million years ago, this rock was dry land exposed to the air. Even more distinct was the pollen. It belonged to conifers and ferns, complex forests that require soil and sunlight to survive. So how did a dry, forested continent end up 2,000 meters underwater? The answer lies in the same destructive force we saw earlier, a mantle plume. The Kerguelen Plateau was sitting directly on top of a massive volcanic hotspot. When this plume was active, the intense heat caused the crust to expand. It became hot, light, and buoyant, floating high above the ocean surface. But in geology, there is a harsh rule. Everything that rises must, sooner or later, come back down. As the tectonic plate drifted away, the volcanic engine died. The rock began to cool, and as it cools, it contracts and becomes denser. Over millions of years, the entire continent slowly lost its buoyancy. Like a hot air balloon running out of fuel, Kerguelen deflated and sank into the dark, dragging its ancient forests down with it. But if Kerguelen sank because it cooled down, our next target was ripped apart by a messy divorce. We travel 15,000 kilometers north to the frigid waters between Norway and Greenland. Here, sitting alone in the middle of the North Atlantic, is the island of Jan Mayen. On the surface, it looks like a simple active volcano. But structurally, this island is an anomaly. Volcanoes usually form only where tectonic plates meet or separate. But Jan Mayen sits in the middle of a plate, far from the boundaries. It shouldn't be here. Seismic scans reveal the volcano is just the visible mask. It is sitting on top of a hidden block of ancient granite, a piece of continental crust that doesn't belong in the ocean at all. Jan Mayen is a microcontinent that got caught in the crossfire. 55 million years ago, Norway and Greenland were attached. When they began to rift apart, the tear wasn't clean. A crack formed, then stalled, then jumped to a new location. In the chaos of this separation, a long strip of land was literally torn off the side of Greenland. Instead of moving west, it was left stranded in the middle of the widening ocean. A lonely piece of the crust, abandoned by the tectonic forces that created the Atlantic. But our final microcontinent is perhaps the most mysterious, because it is hiding in the one place that is hardest to map, the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. This is the Lomonosov Ridge. Discovered only in 1948, this is an underwater mountain range that stretches for 1,800 kilometers, connecting Siberia directly to the Canadian Arctic. Today, it is a towering wall of rock rising 3,000 meters from the floor of the ocean. But drill samples recovered from the ridge in 2004 revealed a stunning secret. The sediment contained fossils of freshwater ferns and shallow water bacteria. This proves that 50 million years ago, this ridge was not only dry land, it was a dam. At that time, the ridge stood high above the waterline. Because of its height, it acted as a physical barrier, blocking the salty water of the Atlantic from entering the polar region. It turned the Arctic into a massive, warm, freshwater lake, a stagnant, swampy paradise at the top of the world, protected by the Lomonosov Wall. But the Earth's crust is not static. As the tectonic plates continued to pull apart, the foundation of the ridge was stretched and thinned. Just like Zealandia, it began to lose its buoyancy. The ridge slowly subsided. The moment its peaks dipped below the waterline, the seal was broken. Cold, salty water from the Atlantic rushed in, transforming it into the Arctic Ocean we know today. Kerguelen, Jan Mayen, Lomonosov. These are the shattered bones of the Earth's past. But while they are dead and gone, the violent process that created them has not stopped. It is happening right now. And we will end our journey not in the deep past, but in the terrifying present. Everything we have seen so far, the stretching of Zealandia, the shattering of Argoland, the separation of Mauritia, is happening again. Right now, we travel to the Horn of Africa, to the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia. This is the most geologically violent place on the planet right now. It is one of the few places on Earth where you can stand on a mid-ocean ridge without getting wet. Here, the ground is literally unzipping beneath our feet. In September 2005, the local Afar herdsmen witnessed the Earth turn against them. In a matter of days, hundreds of earthquakes shook the desert floor, terrifying the livestock and opening fissures in the rock. And then, the ground simply tore apart. A massive crack, 60 kilometers long and 8 meters wide, opened up in the crust. It didn't happen over millions of years. It happened in an instant, ripping the landscape open with the force of a detonating bomb. Scientists rushed to the scene and realized they were witnessing something that usually happens only at the bottom of the ocean. Magma was shooting up from the mantle, wedging itself into the crust like a hydraulic jack. It was physically pushing two massive tectonic plates apart. But this 2005 event was not an isolated incident. It was merely a symptom of the larger mechanics driving the East African rift system. The African continent is not a single solid block. It is splitting in two right now as we speak. The massive Somali plate is pulling away from the Nubian plate at a rate of roughly 7 millimeters per year. That sounds slow, but in geological terms, it is a sprint. The tear begins in the Afar Depression, a scorching alien landscape of salt pans and acid ponds that sits more than 100 meters below sea level. The only thing stopping the Red Sea from flooding this entire basin is a thin, fragile ridge of volcanic rock. Eventually, that ridge will fail. Whether it happens tomorrow in a catastrophic collapse or slowly over 1,000,000 years, the result is inevitable. The Red Sea will pour into the Afar Depression, turning the desert into a new ocean floor. From there, the water will force its way south, following the Rift Valley down through Kenya and Tanzania. And the map of Africa will be redrawn forever. The Horn of Africa, including Somalia, half of Ethiopia, Kenya and Tanzania, will break off completely. It will drift out into the Indian Ocean, becoming a massive new island continent, the Lemuria of the future. This process forces us to confront a reality we usually ignore. We build our cities and draw our borders as if the Earth is a finished painting. We assume the ground is a permanent foundation. But looking at the massive rift running through Ethiopia, a tear that continues to expand with every passing year, we are reminded that the ground is not a guarantee. It is temporary. We have walked the Ghost Atlas. We have seen the giants that drowned, the bridges that collapsed, and the islands that were born from the wreckage. We have seen that the Earth is a dynamic, violent machine that never stops moving. This brings us to the end of the video. I handle the research, writing, and editing for this channel entirely alone. The entire process takes a massive amount of time, but I believe that creating such videos requires a special approach. If you appreciate that effort, and if you want to see more content like this, the best way to support the channel is simply to leave a like on this video. Now, for the next video. There is a fault line off the coast of North America that has been sitting in total silence for over 300 years. It is called the Cascadia subduction zone. It is locked, it is loading, and when it finally releases, it will unleash a megathrust earthquake of magnitude 9.0 that will make the famous San Andreas Fault in California look like a minor tremor. I release new videos every week. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the breakdown of the big one. See you in a week.